Major funding for these programs has been provided by grants from Perfect Building Maintenance and Murray Hill Properties, SJP Properties, Greenburg Traurig, New York Community Bank. Additional funding for these programs has been provided by grants from Akron Gold Brothers, LLC, CB Richard Ellis, City Investment Fund, Cushman & Wakefield, Eastern Consolidated, XL Realty Advisors, LP, Essex Capital Partners, First American Title Insurance Company of New York, Gemini Real Estate Advisors, GVA Williams, Hal Fettner, Durst Fettner Residential, Helmsley Spear, Herbert J. Sims and Company, Herrick Feinstein LLP, Jackson Development Group, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, John Katsimatidis, Kilroy Metal Products, Marcus N. Millichap, Massey Knackle Realty Services, M&T Bank, Madison Realty Capital, Meridian Capital Group, Newmark Knight Frank, Muss Development, Palin Enterprises, Rosenthal & Rosenthal, Signature Bank, Sheldrake Organization, Sterling & Sterling, Stephen Napolitano, Stonehenge Partners, Studley, the Moynihan Organization.
Hello, my name is Michael Stoller, host of BuildingNY. You know, it's an interesting city, New York City. You have people who get into the real estate business by accident, and sometimes they only remain in the real estate business. But today I have a very interesting individual. His name is Francis Greenburger. Francis is the owner of chairman and CEO of Time Equities, a company that owns over 20 million square feet of space in New York and around the world. Thank you for being here today.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for having me.
So you were born in 1949 and you grew up in Forest Hills, but you have a very interesting background. At 11, I think you were delivering newspapers, and what happened after? You were an entrepreneur. You went into the book business?
Well, my father was a literary agent, and I actually started working for him after school. I think when I was 11 or 12. And then through him, when I was 13 or 14, I met a couple of people who got me into kind of ancillary book businesses, again, all while going to school, of course. One of them was a German book club, at that time unknown, named Bertelsmann, who needed an American counterpart to buy English language books to sell in their book club in Germany. And that was a great gig for me because I got one order from them every 3 months and sort of made about $5,000, which was a lot of money in those days.
Right, but you also at that time, you had a rock and roll group when you were about 14?
That lasted for a short while.
But the interesting thing was when you were in the book business, I think at the age of 15 and a half, while you were at Stuyvesant High School, you decided to leave your parents' home in Forest Hills and move in with your 18-year-old girlfriend?
It was love.
It was love. And you also decided to drop out of Stuyvesant.
That was practical.
And what happened at that time, what you said to me, is that you needed an office for your book business.
That's right.
And the office was near the Fuller building, if I remember.
That was actually my second office, but that was shortly after my first office. It was on 59th Street between Park and Lexington.
Right, and you took this office that had 2 rooms. And what happened was, the interesting thing is you paid rent, and you were able to rent the second office for more rent than you were paying.
Exactly. I was just having to walk into the bookstore of my partner in one of my book ventures, and there was a guy in the back of the store who needed to rent a room. And I rented it to him for the amount that I was paying for both rooms. And a light went off that maybe the real estate business is easier than the book business.
But you were saying to me when we met that you also were interested in architecture at that time. You always enjoyed architecture.
I can remember to this day walking down Lower Fifth Avenue and looking up at the buildings when I was in my teens, and just had a kind of visceral connection with the physicality of real estate, with architecture. And as much as my father tried to involve me in his business, in the publishing business, and I was involved, but I didn't have the same kind of chemistry.
But I mean, your father, when he started the business in 1932, he had Kafka. I mean, he had these great novelists, I mean, these great authors. And then what happened was you were dabbling in real estate, but your dad passed away at when you were 21.
Yes.
And at 21, you then went over to the literary agency.
Well, I got rid of a couple of the smaller book businesses that I had started, and took my real estate hat and took the literary agency hat, and sort of went on parallel paths for about 10 years.
And during that time, you had some very interesting authors. I mean, you told me the story about James Patterson.
Yeah, there was a little notice that appeared in the New York Times that said that, unlike some agents, I was reading unsolicited manuscripts, and I got one from a guy working at an advertising agency named James Patterson. I had to submit it to 35 publishers before I could convince one of them to buy it, but they did, and it went on to win Best Edgar for the Best First Mystery.
But you had, I mean, you and the agency, because you still sit, even though you're, I'd say 85% real estate and 15% or...
Maybe 98% real estate.
98% real estate.
I mean, economically.
Right, economically, but you're still the chairman of the board.
Yes.
Of the literary agency. Now, who are some of the other novelists?
Well, heading our list, and probably everybody in the world's list, is Dan Brown. And then we're very proud to represent Nelson DeMille, who's written, I think, 15 #1 bestsellers, and others, popular people today like Christopher Moore, whole cadre of well-known people.
Now, you told me a great, interesting story that, you wanted to phase out of the business when you were close to 30 or 29, I'm not sure about that time. And there was a woman who you had met who needed a job, who became your president?
Well, actually, it was earlier. It was
right.
when I left Stuyvesant, I went to high school at night.
Right, Washington Irving, and then you went to Bernard Baruch for public administration.
I went to Washington Irving Evening High School. And when I was there, in my class, I met this lady who was, during the day, she was a secretary at an engineering firm. And she told me that she typed 90 words a minute and spoke German, which was important because my father had a German client. And my father had a part-time assistant who he was paying almost as much as this lady would have required for full-time. So I suggested it to him, but by that time I'd lost her number. And I looked it up in a phone book, and I called all of the people who had the same last name. I think the 12th family turned out to be hers. And I offered her the job. She took it. It's now 40-odd years later. She's still there. She heads the agency. She's Dan Brown's agent. And she also met her husband in the elevator of our office building. So she would have different children, a different career, a totally different life if I hadn't had that one little idea. Talk about fate.
So let's talk about the real estate business. I mean, you got into the business because you had that opportunity with the 2 rooms. But then you continued. You started buying small buildings, and what were you doing? And then really the conversions, because you were a king. Time Equities was a king in the conversion business in Manhattan and Greenwich Village, which you always loved.
Well, we had, I've actually been probably in the real estate business for at least a decade or more before I did my first conversion, but we had assembled a lot of residential properties in the village, among other places. And one of my investor partners happened to be a lawyer who had handled some co-op legal work and had done 1 or 2 conversions himself. And so he encouraged me to try it with one of our buildings. And so I said, okay. And we put the plan in. I know it was a small building. It was on Bethune Street in the Village. And I didn't know what to expect. And after we finally complied with all the legal details, which are complex, and we put it in, the only thing that happened was the tenant sent me a page-and-a-half long letter with how dare I consider converting their building to co-op, that it was not suitable, and that my plan didn't disclose the effect of Westway on the building, and that wasn't full disclosure, and they were going to complain to the Attorney General's office about it. So I was a little discouraged, but after a few more months went by, one or two people saw the light, and somebody moved out, and at the end of the day, the plan went through.
You know, you were talking to me when we got together, I think it was 1978, you said, or maybe 1980, and you really were unable to find credit. And you got credit basically on your credit cards or like an installment. And then suddenly, you know, there was one bank, Irving Trust, who may have given you $100,000, and then M&T Bank came with $250,000, and then, you know, maybe it was the bankers, not today because of what we're living in, then the bankers, Chemical Bank said to you, here's $2 million, and then they went to $25 million?
I think they went to 50.
50 million.
It was an extraordinary event in my business life. I remember when they agreed to the $2 million, they walked into my office, and I had explained that I had this little line of credit from Irving Trust, and then we'd gone to M&T, but that my business was growing, and it really wasn't enough for my needs. And they said, well, how much do you need? And I said, well, I need $2 million. And I'd given them my financial statement, but I think I'd given it to them in that meeting, and they just kind of looked at it cursorily. And they said, well, you got it. And I said, well, what do you mean I got it? You're going to recommend it? You're going to underwrite me, whatever? They said, no, you've got it. I said, well, does that mean that I could draw on it tomorrow? They said, yes. So the next day I got up and I drew $250,000. The money appeared in my bank account. And that's how my relationship with Chemical began. It was quite something. Let's
talk about one of your large initial developments when you were very young was near Pratt.
Yes.
In Clinton Hill.
Clinton Hill was a complex of 12 buildings comprising, I think, 1,300 apartments. And it had been built as Navy housing just after the war. And over the course of the 50s and 60s, it had changed, and the demographic became more Afro-American. And the man who owned it had syndicated it to about 1,000 investors, and he was concerned the building wasn't doing well. It was suffering from rent control, had a lot of deferred maintenance, and he was afraid that he was going to die and there wouldn't be anybody to look after it. So I had this idea to convert it to co-ops, even though it was financially not doing well, thinking that for the group, for the people.
Right, it was a great opportunity for this group to have the home ownership opportunity.
It was a home ownership opportunity, and for the people that lived in this community, they considered it as a community that was on the upper end. It's a place they aspired to live to, just like people aspired to live in Forest Hills. Many, particularly black families, aspired to live in Clinton Hill. It was a good place to be. And so we started this plan, but we had no idea what would happen. And we had quite an adventure, but over time it became immensely successful. I remember begging Equitable Life, who had the first mortgage, first mortgage for $5,000 an apartment. I begged them to let that roll into the co-op, and they said no, we want out. And I think they offered me a 25% discount, give them $4.5 million, and they would be gone. And I literally probably went to 100 banks And it was Citigroup who had rejected it earlier, but somehow on a second look, someone that had a credit policy there had some issues raised by the Congress about their redlining, and they contacted me and said, look, if you could demonstrate to us that this has political support, we'll give you a loan, take out equitable, finance the purchasers, etc., which is what they did.
Then, I mean, everyone in New York, everyone in the world knows about Tudor City. Tell my audience a little bit about what Tudor City was, and what you and Phil did with Tudor City.
Well, Tudor City, which is located near the United Nations in New York and spans 3 blocks, goes from 41st Street to 43rd Street, also comprises about a dozen very large buildings and totals about 3,500 apartments. And it had long been the center of a major controversy because there's a park in the middle of Tudor City, which all of the residents were very attached to and really was the center of life at Tudor City. And Harry Helmsley had said that he didn't, that he was going to build new buildings on the park, and they would no longer be available as parkland. And the residents were up in arms, and there was a 10-year battle between Helmsley and the residents about this. They laid down in front of the bulldozers, etc. And when I got involved, together with Phil Pileski, we were to start with one building, which we did, but as we got into it, we recognized that unless we could control the parks, we would not be able to convince the people who lived in Tudor City that it was a good plan to buy their apartments. And so we acquired the parks from Helmsley together with an option on all the other properties. And we began the conversion of all of these 10 or 12 different buildings comprising 3,000 apartments. And at first there was a lot of questions about whether apartments that small, because the Tudor City apartments typically were very small, people would want to buy them. But when we opened the sales office, they came out in droves, and it was a very, very successful sellout.
Our studio is on 35th Street, and you bought some property on 37th and 38th Street, the Sloan building?
Yes.
What'd you do with that?
Actually, what happened was I first bought a building on 37th, 559 West 37th Street, which had a connection with a building on 38th Street. It was like a bridge through the back of the building. But we didn't buy the back of the building at that time. And we converted the 37th Street loft building into office space. And then one day, that had been assembled by the Minskoff family, the old Sloan's property. And then at a certain point, they decided to abandon it. And so the adjacent building came on the market, and one next to it. So we ended up buying it and converted it to office space too, although it was not a freehold, it was a long-term leasehold.
And then where you are today, you've been at 55 Fifth Avenue. What happened over there?
In the early 80s, because our business had grown a great deal, and I suffered the experience of many office building tenants of needing additional space. And although the Durst family are wonderful builders, they're also for-profit businessmen, and if you're a captive in a building and you need more space, you pay a premium. So I kept paying a premium to find additional office space, and I decided that I couldn't do this anymore. And a property came on the market where Yeshiva University owned this building at 55th Avenue between 12th and 13th Street. And they were having financial difficulties. I think the building was in foreclosure. And Yeshiva figured out that they could sell half of it and have enough money to pay off their mortgage and save the other half for their law school. And we walked in at the right moment and made the deal. I remember they're saying that I had to be prepared to sign the contract and close in 3 days or something, which I did agree to do, and we were prepared. But the lawyers took a lot longer than that.
You were one of the visionaries in the early 90s with, fortunately, with the changes in the 421Gs and other things. You went to Lower Manhattan. Why do you like Lower Manhattan? And you bought the Delmonico building. Tell my audience a little bit about that.
Well, I suppose not unlike many people in the real estate business, there were those that knew downtown and there were those that didn't know downtown. I was among the people who really didn't know downtown. I didn't know Beaver from Broad Street from whatever. And but suddenly I became aware that although I did own one building down on West and Rector Street, so I knew the Battery Park area, but I didn't really know the East of Broadway area. And all of a sudden, you know, we started seeing prices for buildings in that area that were just unbelievably inexpensive, literally $5 a foot. And
I mean, for my audience, people like you, Joe Moynihan, Larry Silverstein, in the 90s bought buildings for $5 a foot.
$5 a foot. 25 Broad Street, which I don't know what was traded for recently, some hundreds of millions,
Right.
and traded for $25 a foot, or about $2.5 million for a 500,000 foot square building. And this Beaver Street, which was one of the first ones that I bought downtown, was a beautiful, beautiful architectural icon that actually contained Delmonico's restaurant, which reputedly is the oldest restaurant in America. And it had undergone a $10 million renovation a couple of years before I bought the building. But it had been closed because business was that bad. And the building was owned by a mutual benefit life and insurance company, or they had foreclosed on it. And some people had tried to buy it from them, but couldn't come up with the money to close. And literally within, I think they had 24 hours left on their contract, I put them in a room at Jack Wepburn's office, well-known New York real estate lawyer. And they finally agreed to sign the contract, and we closed on the purchase. And that was sort of the beginning of my interest in Lower Manhattan.
But your interest today is major in Lower Manhattan. You have the building where Cadwallader used to be, where I'd like you to describe, and then also the new mixed-use hotel condo.
The Cadwallader, the building that Cadwallader occupied part of, 125 Maiden Lane, was a building that I bought probably around the year 2000, I'm not sure. And it was a 325,000 foot office building. High quality B office building. I bought it from Reef Insurance Company, who maintained it extremely well. And Cadwallader had their headquarters across the street, and they were growing, so any space that we had available, they needed. And so the building was constantly full. But then about 2 or 3 years ago, or 4 years ago, whenever it was, Cadwallader made the decision to move from their headquarters building, as well as from our building, over to Battery Park, to the World Financial Center. And so I was losing my major tenant and trying to figure out what to do. And one option, which a lot of buildings downtown had taken, was to convert to residential. And in fact, there were residential buildings, new buildings, being built to the right and left of us. But I had heard years ago, I had somebody working for me who was actually involved in one of the first office condominiums in New York. It was done in the 90s. And I'd been hearing about that as a market, particularly for not-for-profit organizations, and thought that rather than trying to vacate the rest of my building, because it was still 50% occupied, that it would be worth seeing whether there would be a market for these office condominiums. And so we put a plan together, and we put it out on the market. And to our surprise, the 50-pound elephant came along and bought half the building right off the bat, and that was the ESDC, State of New York. And although subsequently they changed their minds and we had to resell the floors for them.
Talk about the new hotel and the condo.
The new hotel is on the corner near Rector and West Street, right opposite Battery Park. And it's a site that I've owned for about 25 years. We demolished the buildings that are there. And we're planning to build a 65-story apartment and hotel. The hotel will be a 5-star boutique hotel run by a very prominent hotelier out of London. And the apartments will be geared towards families because, first of all, one of the few major new elementary schools in the city is being built right across the street. And generally, we've observed that the demand for family apartments, not gigantic ones, but ones that normal people can live in, is very strong downtown. And people who work in Battery Park City are a captive market in a sense.
You know, you've gone down to Hoyt and Skemhorn and you built these townhouses.
In Brooklyn, we were awarded. We responded to an RFP that the city had for actually at the time it was a couple of square blocks of land in downtown Brooklyn that had been condemned for redevelopment, but actually never redeveloped. They sat in the city's hands for about a decade or more. And we put a plan in for mixed use that would have part of the site faced a street of brownstones. So we proposed building townhouses on that block to complement what was a beautiful historic street. And the rest of the site would receive higher density, high-rise apartments and mixed use.
You have 4 children.
Yes.
Their names are?
Noah, Morgan, Julia, and Claire.
Okay, have to make sure.
Sure.
And mentors in your life?
Well, I think I've had several. I think the number one, certainly in the real estate business, is Charlie Benenson. Charlie and I became good friends in the early 80s, and I think we had lunch probably every 2 or 3 months for the next 20 years. He was an extraordinary man, as we all know. But I had other mentors, a man named Milton Newmark, who sold me one of my first buildings, and in the process asked me that if I never needed an investor, he'd like to partner with me, and subsequently became a partner in 25 or more buildings. Charlie and Milton are pivotal people in my life.
Conclusion, you know, you had that opportunity in the book business, which you still had, and you had the opportunity in real estate. And what you've truly become over the years, you know, and now you're even doing industrial in Brooklyn, I believe, on Sunset Park.
We're the designated developer for 1.2 million square foot
right. So you've
industrial
truly
property.
been an interesting person and truly a builder of New York. I'd like to thank you for being here.
Michael, thank you for having me.
Major funding for these programs has been provided by grants from Perfect Building Maintenance and Murray Hill Properties, SJP Properties, Greenburg Traurig, New York Community Bank. Additional funding for these programs has been provided by grants from Akron Gold Brothers, LLC, C.B. Richard Ellis, City Investment Fund, Cushman & Wakefield, Eastern Consolidated, XL Realty Advisors, LP, Essex Capital Partners, First American Title Insurance Company of New York, Gemini Real Estate Advisors, GVA Williams, Hal Fettner, Durst Fettner Residential, Helmsley Spear, Herbert J. Sims and Company, Herrick Feinstein LLP, Jackson Development Group, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, John Katsimatidis, Kilroy Metal Products, Marcus N. Millichap, Massey Knackle Realty Services, M&T Bank, Madison Realty Capital, Meridian Capital Group, Newmark Knight Frank, Muss Development, Palin Enterprises, Rosenthal and Rosenthal, Signature Bank, Sheldrake Organization, Sterling and Sterling, Stephen Napolitano, Stonehenge Partners, Studley, the Moynihan Organization.